No father, no mother, no date of birth, no record of death. There is a man in the Bible who appears in just 3 verses. He comes out of nowhere in the middle of a war. He blesses the most powerful man in the ancient world. He receives from him 10% of everything he owns, and then he vanishes. He, never to be seen again. The Bible never explains where he came from. It never explains where he went. And 1,000 years later, a manuscript hidden in a desert cave would reveal something about this man that 3 religions spent 2,000 years trying to bury, that he may never have been a man at all. This is the investigation into the greatest unsolved mystery in the Bible. His name was Melchizedek. To understand why this encounter is so unsettling, forget theology for a moment. Let's go to the scene. It's around 1800 BC, in the land of Canaan. 4 kings from the north, led by a man named Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, have just crushed a coalition of 5 kings from the south. They sacked cities, they took captives, and among the captives was a man named Lot. Lot was the nephew of a semi-nomadic herdsman who wasn't even called Abraham yet. He was called Abram. And here's where the story turns extraordinary. This herdsman gathered 318 men. Just 318. He chased the 4 victorious kings for over 100 miles, and he hit them at night by surprise. And he won. He defeated the 4 armies that had just defeated 5 kings. He recovered the captives. He recovered the plunder. He recovered Lot. In that moment, Abram was the most powerful man in the entire region. No one could challenge him. And it was at that exact moment of supreme glory that a stranger walked out of a city called Salem to meet him and brought Abram to his knees. The city of Salem. A man in priestly robes carrying bread and wine. The text of Genesis chapter 14 describes the encounter in 3 dry verses. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought bread and wine, for he was priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, and Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. Read it again slowly, because every word hides a problem. King of Salem. Salem in Hebrew comes from the root meaning peace, shalom. Most scholars believe Salem is the future Jerusalem. But no one is absolutely certain. Priest of God Most High. In Hebrew, El Elyon, but we're 400 years before Moses, before the 10 Commandments, before the God of Israel was revealed by that name. So, which God exactly did this man serve? And the third problem is the most disturbing of all. Why did Abram, and the most powerful man in the region, who had just refused gifts from the king of Sodom, so he'd owe nothing to anyone, kneel before this stranger and voluntarily hand him 10% of everything? The tithe wasn't a gift. It was an act of submission. It was the acknowledgement of an authority higher than his own. The man who would come to be called the father of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam acknowledged in that desert that there was someone above him. But who? Hold on to that question, because the Bible will mention Melchizedek 2 more times, separated by more than 1,000 years, and each time the mystery gets bigger, not smaller. First reappearance, 800 years later. Around 1000 BC, King David, the greatest king of Israel, writes Psalm 110, and in it, speaking of the Messiah to come, he writes a line impossible to ignore. You are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. Forever, after the order of Melchizedek. Notice what this means. 800 years after that encounter in the desert, Melchizedek wasn't a forgotten footnote. He was the model, the pattern of a priesthood that lasts forever. A king of a tiny town who appears in 3 verses became the symbol of eternal priesthood for the greatest king of Israel. Why? What did David know about Melchizedek that we don't? And then, 1,000 years after David, 2,000 years after Abram, comes the most extraordinary text of all, the text that stopped entire generations of theologians. In the 1st century AD, a Christian author, whose identity, by perfect irony, is also unknown, writes the letter to the Hebrews. And about Melchizedek, he writes these words: without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, he remains a priest forever. Stop and read with surgical attention. Without beginning of days, without end of life, A lot of people read this and think, it means his genealogical records were lost, that we don't know who his parents were. But that's not what the text says. The author doesn't write whose genealogy was not preserved. He writes without beginning of days. No beginning, no end. This is not a statement about missing documents. It's a statement about the nature of his being. The author is saying Melchizedek had no beginning to record, no end to document. It's not that nobody knows where he came from, it's that he came from nowhere. And this is where 3,000 years of debate begin. Because if Melchizedek was not born and did not die, what was he? Over 2,000 years, 3 answers emerged, 3 theories, and not one of them won. I'll lay out all 3, and why each one fails. Theory 1, the human king. The explanation most accepted by modern scholarship. Melchizedek was simply a priest-king of Jerusalem before the Israelites, a Canaanite ruler who worshipped El Elyon, a local deity, and whose genealogical records simply didn't survive to reach us. And there's real archaeological support for this. The texts of the ancient city of Ugarit on the Mediterranean mention priests of El in Canaanite contexts. The figure of a king who was also a priest was common in that region. It's plausible, it's sober, it's probably what a historian would choose, but it has a fatal problem. It doesn't explain the letter to the Hebrews, because the author of Hebrews didn't say, "We don't know his origin." He said, "without beginning of days." The human king theory explains the silence of Genesis, but it doesn't explain why, 1,000 years later, someone claimed he had no beginning and no end. Theory 2, he was Shem, the son of Noah. This was the dominant theory in medieval Judaism, and the logic is fascinating. According to the ages the Bible itself gives, Shem, the son of Noah, would have lived 600 years. And if we take the biblical dates literally, Shem would still have been alive in the time of Abram. Imagine the weight of that. The son of the only survivor of the flood, 600 years old, still alive, keeper of the memory of the world before the catastrophe. What religious authority could be greater? This would explain why Abram knelt. The Babylonian Talmud defends this identification. Rashi, the greatest Jewish commentator of the Middle Ages, defends it too, but it also fails. And it fails for the most obvious reason possible. Shem had a father. His name was Noah. Shem had a mother, had brothers, had one of the most famous genealogies in the entire Bible. If the author of Hebrews meant Melchizedek was Shem, why would he say he was without father, without mother, without genealogy? It's the direct contradiction. Theory 3, he was not human. The third theory is the one the Hebrews text itself seems to push, and it's the most disturbing. Melchizedek was not a man. He was a divine manifestation, a celestial being who took human form to meet Abram at one exact moment in history, without father or mother, because he wasn't born, without end of life, because he cannot die. For centuries, this was considered mystical speculation, an overreading of a poetic text, until in 1947 a shepherd looking for a lost goat threw a stone into a cave, and what he found there would prove that this third theory, the most impossible of the 3, already existed 800 years before Christianity, written by Jews about Melchizedek, and it said something no one was prepared to read. 1947, the Judean desert near the Dead Sea. A young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Edadib is searching for a goat that wandered off from the flock through the hills of Qumran. To scare the animal out, he throws a stone into a dark opening in the rock. But instead of the sound of a stone hitting a wall, he hears pottery shattering. He goes into the cave, and he finds clay jars, sealed over 2,000 years old. Inside them, rolled up, leather scrolls covered in ancient writing in Hebrew and Aramaic. These were the Dead Sea Scrolls, the greatest archaeological find of the 20th century for understanding the origins of Judaism and Christianity. Texts written by an isolated Jewish community, most likely the Essenes, between 200 BC and 70 AD. Hundreds of manuscripts, biblical copies 1,000 years older than any we'd had, hymns, rules, prophecies, and one text found in cave number 11, catalogued with a cold code, 11Q13, and what 11Q13 says about Melchizedek changed the debate forever. Because in this text, written by Jews, at least a century before Jesus was born, Melchizedek is not a king, not a human priest, not the son of Noah. He is described as a celestial being, a divine prince who will preside over the final judgment on the last day, who will, so in the words of the text, make atonement for the sons of light and carry out the judgment of God over the angels of darkness.
Death and rebirth.
And there's more.
It
The
can't
part
be.
that left the translators in shock when the text was deciphered in the 1960s. The Qumran text applies to Melchizedek the Hebrew word Elohim. Elohim, the word used for God. Not a servant of God, not a messenger of God. The text places Melchizedek in the position of a divine figure presiding over the heavenly assembly. Understand what this means for the timeline. For centuries, the idea of Melchizedek as a celestial being was thought to be a Christian invention, a way the early Christians found to link Jesus to the Old Testament. But 11Q13 proves otherwise. It proves that Jews, centuries before Christ, already awaited Melchizedek as a divine figure who would return at the end of time to judge the world. When the author of Hebrews later uses Melchizedek to explain Jesus, he isn't inventing anything. He's using a category his Jewish audience already knew and already feared, and there's a second text at Qumran that deepens the abyss. A text that speaks of a prince of lights in eternal war against the angel of darkness. And several scholars argue that this prince of light and the Melchizedek of 11Q13 are the same being, a being of light, at war with darkness, who appeared once to a herdsman in the desert and whom this community was waiting anxiously to return. Now we can go back to the letter to the Hebrews and understand why the author was so obsessed with Melchizedek, because there was an enormous theological problem he needed to solve. The problem was this: in Jewish law, only a descendant of Aaron, of the tribe of Levi, could be a priest. It was a matter of blood, of lineage, of birth. And Jesus was not of the tribe of Levi. He was of the tribe of Judah, the tribe of kings, not of priests. By the law, Jesus could never be a priest, never, unless there existed another kind of priesthood, older, before the law of Moses, before the tribe of Levi itself, a priesthood that didn't depend on blood, and it existed. It had existed once, in the desert, 1,000 years before Moses. The order of Melchizedek. The author's argument is brilliantly engineered. He says, the Levitical priesthood depends on men who are born and die, and so must be replaced generation after generation. It is a mortal priesthood. But Melchizedek, no beginning, no end, represents an eternal priesthood, one that doesn't die, that needs no replacement. And he goes further, with a stroke of logic that still impresses today. When Abram paid the tithe to Melchizedek, the author says, Levi hadn't even been born yet, but Levi was biologically inside Abram, his descendant. Therefore, in Abram, Levi himself paid the tithe to Melchizedek. The Levitical priesthood, without knowing it, bowed before the order of Melchizedek 1,000 years before it existed. That's why the author of Hebrews declares Jesus a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, the exact words of David's psalm closing a 1,000-year arc. And this leaves one final Christian question, which opened a new theory. If Melchizedek prefigures Christ so perfectly, and if he appears with no origin, blessing, with bread and wine in his hands, the exact symbols of the Eucharist, and if he had no beginning and no end, what if Melchizedek wasn't just a shadow of Christ, but Christ himself, appearing to Abram 1,000 years before being born in Bethlehem? This interpretation, called a Christophany, was defended by three of the greatest theologians of early Christianity, Ambrose, Augustine, and Jerome. And that's why, even today, in every Catholic Mass in the world, the name of Melchizedek is spoken aloud by the priest at the moment of the offering. 3,800 years after that encounter in the desert, the priest with no origin is still invoked every single day in thousands of churches. From here we leave official theology and enter darker territory. the territory where the figure of Melchizedek was adopted by secret orders and where we have to carefully separate documented history from tradition and legend. I'll be clear about that difference throughout this part, but the story is fascinating even when it crosses into the realm of mystery. Let's start with the Knights Templar. The order was founded in Jerusalem in 1119 with an official mission to protect Christian pilgrims. But they settled in a very specific place, over the ruins of the Temple of Solomon on the Temple Mount. And here is the connection that fueled centuries of speculation. According to tradition, the Temple Mount where Solomon reigned was the same mount where Melchizedek had reigned as king of Salem 1,000 years earlier. The same ground, the place of the priest with no origin. It's historically certain that the Templars settled there. What is tradition and not proven fact is what some say they were searching for beneath that ground. When the order was destroyed in 1307, when King Philip the Fair of France, crushed by debts to the Templars, accused them of heresy and had them arrested en masse on a Friday the 13th. The Inquisition's interrogations recorded strange accusations, secret rituals, an initiatory figure that some accounts describe as an eternal priest. Historians still debate how much of those confessions was real and how much was extracted under torture. But the association between the Templars and the figure of the eternal priest-king survived, and it resurfaced centuries later in an unexpected place, in Freemasonry. Here too we need care. The direct historical link between the medieval Templars and modern Freemasonry is itself more tradition than documented fact. But here's what is fact. Freemasonry adopted Melchizedek. In the Masonic system known as the York Rite, there is a degree called the Royal Arch, considered by many the high point of the entire tradition. And one of the central figures associated with that degree is Melchizedek. The priest with no genealogy became the symbol of the bearer of the oldest knowledge there is, the one who was a priest before there was a priesthood, a king before there was a royal lineage. I won't go into the ritual content, partly out of respect, partly because much of what circulates about it is speculation. But the point that matters is this. Nearly 4,000 years after that encounter in the desert, a man who appears in 3 verses of the Bible is still venerated in secret by millions of people around the world. Why did such a small figure in the text leave such an enormous trail across history? Hold that question for the end. Because Melchizedek doesn't belong to the Christian West alone. There's another figure on the other side of the religious world who is his perfect shadow. And when you see the two side by side, it becomes hard to believe it's a coincidence. In Islam, there is a mysterious figure called Al-Khidr, the Green Man. He appears in the Quran in chapter 18, the Surah of the Cave. He meets the prophet Moses and teaches him through 3 acts that seem, at first sight, incomprehensible and even cruel. But that hide a wisdom Moses could not see. Now notice the parallels with Melchizedek. Like Melchizedek, Al-Khidr appears with no clear genealogy. Like Melchizedek, he appears, acts with absolute authority, and vanishes. Like Melchizedek, tradition debated for centuries whether he was human or something more. And like Melchizedek, many describe him as immortal, a being who still walks the earth, appearing to lost travelers, to those who have eyes to see him. The great French Orientalist Henry Corbin studied this connection deeply, and he argued that Melchizedek and Al-Khidr represent the same archetype, the eternal guide who appears in moments of crisis to pass on a knowledge that cannot be obtained by normal human means. But the strangest version of Melchizedek of all is in neither the Bible nor the Quran. It's in a text that lay buried in Egypt for 1,500 years. In the Gnostic traditions, the spiritual schools of the first centuries of Christianity, later declared heretical and suppressed, Melchizedek holds a cosmic position. In a text called the Pistis Sophia, rediscovered and dated to around the 3rd century, Melchizedek is neither king nor priest. He is described as the great receiver of the light. His function, according to the text, is to gather the pure light trapped in human souls and carry it back to the heavenly realms. A cosmic being with a single timeless function to separate light from darkness and carry it home. And here's the detail that gives chills. This Gnostic vision, Melchizedek as a being of light operating outside of time, matches almost perfectly what the Dead Sea Scrolls said. The Prince of Lights of Qumran and the Receiver of the Light of the Pistis Sophia. Two traditions, separated by centuries, separated by different languages, cultures and deserts, with no contact between them. And both describe the same figure, with no origin, made of light, a mediator between the human and the divine. How did isolated traditions arrive at the same impossible image of the same man from 3 verses? Let's come down from the texts to the earth, to archaeology. Because it has something to say, excavations in Jerusalem have shown the city has been continuously inhabited for at least 5,500 years. At the time the Bible places Abram's encounter with Melchizedek, around 1800 BC, Jerusalem already existed, a Canaanite city called Urushalim, and the name appears in a real verifiable place, the Amarna letters, the diplomatic correspondence of the pharaohs of Egypt from the 14th century BC, written on clay tablets that survive to this day. In 2 of those letters, the ruler of Urushalim writes to the pharaoh, and he uses curious language. He presents himself not just as a king, but with titles that mix political and religious function. A ruler who was also a priestly figure. 450 years after the supposed encounter with Abram, the pattern of the priest-king of Salem still persisted in that city. And there's an even more recent discovery. Excavations near the Temple Mount have found layers of occupation dating exactly to the period of Abram, the Middle Bronze Age, and in them, signs of a sophisticated religious life, ritual objects, structures suggesting sacred spaces, a city with an organized high-level religion, exactly at the time and place the biblical text places Melchizedek as king of Salem. Let's be honest about what this proves and what it doesn't. Archaeology has not found Melchizedek. It never will. You don't go looking for the footprint of a man the text itself says had no beginning. But archaeology confirms one thing, that in that place, at that time, there existed a religious civilization sophisticated enough to produce exactly the kind of priest-king Genesis describes. The setting is real, the city is real, the context is real. Only the man remains impossible. So we come back to the beginning, to the question that opened this documentary. Who was Melchizedek? We've seen the 3 theories, and we've seen each one collapse. The human king theory is sober, but it doesn't explain why 1,000 years of texts insist he had no beginning and no end. The Shem theory explains the authority, but it crashes head-on into the words, without father, without mother. The celestial being theory explains the texts, but it doesn't explain how a divine apparition walks into a chronicle of a real war as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And maybe, and this is a hypothesis, not a conclusion, the question has no answer by design. Not for lack of information, but because Melchizedek represents exactly what human language cannot contain. A presence prior to the categories we use to describe existence, prior to father and mother, prior to birth and death, prior to the very religious systems that each in its own way tried to capture him, and none could. Notice something that runs through this entire story. The author of Genesis never tries to explain who Melchizedek was. David doesn't explain. Nor does the author of Hebrews, nor the Qumran texts. It's as if everyone across 3,000 years understood the same thing, that some realities can only be pointed at, never fully described. Abram in the desert didn't ask for explanations. He saw the man come out of Salem with bread and wine. He instantly recognized an authority higher than his own. He knelt, he gave the tithe, and he went on his way. Maybe the right question was never, who was Melchizedek? Maybe the right question is, what is it inside us that recognizes in an instant an authority with no origin and no end, and kneels before it? That question has no archaeological answer. No answer in the manuscripts. It has only the answer each of us finds within. If this mystery held you all the way here, there are others in the same Bible that few people know and that are just as unsettling. Here on the channel, I dig into each one. Subscribe, hit the bell, and tell me in the comments, of the 3 theories, which one do you believe? Human king, son of Noah, or something that was never human. I'm reading every reply, because the story doesn't end here.